So thanks everybody for coming here today. I'm going to talk about performance analysis and monitoring of multiple servers on the cheap. And this was sort of an outgrowth of something I did last year where I talked about PAL, the performance analysis of logs tool, which was kind of useful for doing server performance analysis on an individual basis. But it doesn't scale very well at all. And as a matter of fact, I tried to do it by writing these XML files that included long lists of servers and various counters and everything. And it's, unless you have enormous patience, it's not going to work. So I started looking for some other alternatives, and one of the things I ran into was a newer version of something that has been out for a while that I think is fairly interesting and fairly useful. It definitely has some of its oddities and quirks, which we'll hopefully talk about today. But I think there's some interesting things there, and of course, it's cheap. So out of curiosity, how many people are first-time BriForum? Yeah, so that looks a third to a half of you. Welcome, congratulations. Okay, so the way I run presentations, by the way, is I strongly encourage questions as they come up. I'm going to try and leave some time for QA at the end, but I think some of the best presentations here at BriForum involve dialogue back and forth with the audience. So from the exception of Tim Mangan, I'll welcome questions from anybody at any time. Anybody who's presented at more than like 8 BriForums, I don't think you're allowed to heckle me or ask any questions, but anybody less than that is cool with me. So the first thing I'm going to start out with is, and it may seem like a stupid question, is why do you want to do some performance monitoring? Sure, there's kind of an obvious question to that, but I think there's some details to that. You know, the first issue might be compliance. And by that, I don't really mean a regulatory compliance thing. I mean like a service level agreement. We ran into some situations where we had some customers who wanted to do SLAs with us, but we didn't really have a mechanism for defining the SLA. We could make up these wonderful IT things, you know, like we have 4 nines availability or something like that, but you know, as far as I'm concerned, there's lies, damn lies, statistics, and IT uptime numbers. I've actually sat in meetings where we had discussions with project managers about what constitutes uptime. If no one can log in, but the people already are logged in can work, are you down? Is that a disruption? Why no, people are working. You know, from my perspective, if people can't log in and those people give you money every month, you have a problem. So in terms of setting up an SLA, those uptime numbers I don't think sometimes are very useful. What you can do sometimes, I think, with your more tech-savvy customers is guarantee a certain level of performance metrics. And you have to pull that in some way and be able to supply that to them. So that's one of the reasons why you might want to do it outside of just your general self-interest. The other, of course, is customers voting with their feet. I'm in an application service provider environment. I work for Thomson Reuters in the tax and accounting division. So we host our tax and accounting applications on Citrix as an ASP, and we also do a bunch of other things like Microsoft Office. We have around 50 published apps. And those people are basically on a subscription SaaS model with us. So when they get unhappy, they can leave. And when revenue goes down, we hear about it. So getting in front of any performance issues and making sure we can define certain levels of performance and have an idea of what's going on is really important, because when the sales guys get on the phone about customers canceling, pretty much all hell breaks loose over in my corner of the world. Another reason is time to resolution. This is the way the world is, right? We all have problems. It's just a question of how many problems, how severe they are. So the quicker you can resolve a problem, the better off you are. And typically I find that you need some information in order to get a resolution, right? So the quicker you can get that information, the quicker you can get an idea what's going on, the quicker you can fix what's happening. Forecasting and trending, I think that's an integral part of performance monitoring. In our situation, we've grown pretty well, even through the recession. For several years, we were averaging around 20% growth in users, and as we've passed the 15,000 user mark, we've slowed down a bit just as that number has gotten bigger. But we're still adding usually double-digit percentage number of users every year. And it gets a little interesting with us because the app mix always changes, right? You know, we supply Microsoft Office. If you've seen what the login VSI guys are doing lately, you'll see that Office 2013 does some really interesting things to your terminal servers in not a positive way. But you certainly have also seen changes from Office 2003 to 2007. We have a tax application that essentially gets rewritten from scratch every year. And that performs very differently in its first and second releases from its final releases. And then we've got accounting applications that are shifting through different versions and different backends and different architectures and all the time. So nothing is terribly static for us. So we need to keep some sort of forecasting and trending thing going, and we need it on a regular basis, not kind of after the fact, because we don't want to be surprised by any one of these step graphs like this, when all of a sudden you find that your accounting application is pulling on average 500 megabytes more RAM than it was 3 months ago. And finally, I think one of the things that's really overlooked, but it's been useful for us, are proposals and ROI. You know, it's a do more with less world, right? I don't know of anybody who's awash in budget money these days. So every time we want to do something, no matter how silly it sounds, we need some proposal and some sort of metrics to back it up. I proposed to a project manager earlier this year that we just needed to add some RAM to some servers rather than buy servers. And the response back is, I need metrics. Well, are your metrics the 300 phone calls we took last month about people complaining that the application were slow? So you can pull these sorts of information to justify a proposal. And to me, one of the most useful things from a purely selfish standpoint is the ROI. I was able to sit down a couple of years and say, you know what, I told you we needed to do this, I provided you with some numbers, we got a project going, we completed this project, and here's the forecasting and trending information we had over time. You know, our average disk responsiveness was averaging 38 seconds or something like that, you know, 6 months ago, and now we're down to 9 seconds. So I've got some concrete numbers to be able to show you, and that gives you credibility, and you know, come annual review time, concrete numbers that you did something good is not a bad thing to have, at least in my part of the world. But why not? There's also some reasons not to do some performance monitoring, particularly if we're talking about what might be kind of a stealth project or a skunkworks project, something that you're doing for free, maybe something that you're doing in your own department. The first issue is duplication. I work in one of these enormously large organizations that's in 120 countries. We have data centers around the world. We have data center operations staff who I can't even keep track of who these people are most of the time. So there's a hardware team, and they get reports from the HP ProLiant servers that we have. Those blades have their own hardware monitoring agents, their own performance stuff, and they all report to a console over here. And then there's a data center operations team, and they're using something else. They might be using Negos or something like that, and they're pulling their own information over here. And every once in a while, the green team comes around, right? Those guys want to look at power consumption on servers and do surveys on that. And then the virtualization bozos come around to tell me my job, and they want to pull a bunch of numbers on the utilization of my servers and tell me how I really should be virtualizing this on their oversubscribed architecture that I don't want to have anything to do with. So it's not inconceivable that you can find yourself buried in 6 or 7 layers of monitoring tools. And that's not really great. You know, modern operating systems, modern servers have a lot of horsepower to them, so it's not like a few years ago where it was pretty easy to cripple a box with too much monitoring. But you can certainly do it. And I like to run my boxes a little hard. I like to get my money's worth out of them. So if you start layering on 5, 6, 7 layers of this stuff, particularly if somebody's using some default setting in some configuration manager console somewhere that pulls 150 performance monitor counters every 3 seconds, you can get a non-trivial kind of load on your systems. Lack of context is another issue, I think. You pull the numbers mean what? The number is 20. What does 20 mean? Is 20 good? Is 20 bad? I think 20 is good. I think 20 is bad. Now what? An extreme example of this, but I'm not making this up. I once had a discussion, I'll call it, with an Exchange administrator because we were taking a lot of calls from our users in the field that Outlook was very slow connecting to their Exchange mailboxes. So we originally pinged them, asked if there were any issues. They said no. We continued investigating things, looked around, finally got access to some numbers on their boxes and found out that the series of backups they were running would peg the Exchange servers at 100% CPU for more than a week at a time because they were doing these brick level and mailbox level and all this stuff. So we came back to this guy and we're like, I thought you said there were no problems with the Exchange servers. He said, there isn't. They're running at 100% CPU. So? He says, we have servers that run at 100% CPU all the time. It's not really an issue. We have these things over here that convert files into PDFs. They run at 100%. I'm like, that's a batch OCR service. You upload stuff, you wait for an email that says your conversion is done. This is real-time interactive stuff where people are trying to click on their email and they're getting an 8-second delay between moving between mail items. So we went back and forth with that. And we were finally able to find some Microsoft guidance. I think actually there's an Exchange server performance tool or assessment tool. I'm not an Exchange guy, I don't know the name of it. But we were finally able to pull that out, and lo and behold, Microsoft does not recommend that you run your mail servers at 100% CPU for days at a time. Shocking, I know, but that was his position. So complexity is another thing. A lot of these products out there are fairly complex and not easy to understand. Not only is there an issue with understanding the data, but there's just an issue with devoting time to them, right? Anything that's complex takes some time to learn. We may not have the manpower to do it. There are some wonderful tools out there in the commercial world that you pay for that are enormously complex. And not only do you have the issues of understanding what they're giving you, but they want to worm their way into your architecture, right? They want to put agents here, they want to put monitoring here and taps here and this and that. And all of a sudden you find out it seems like you're working for this monitoring vendor, right? You're having to adjust your architecture to meet the needs of what they're doing. So if you can get your information without being complex, I think that's a bonus. So cost is always an issue. Cost is what drove some of the things that I've been doing. I went for free tools because I didn't have the budget. And what budget we had for performance stuff had already long been spent. And then there's just the issue of the right tool. I mean, are you trying to pound a square peg into a round hole? You've always got to make sure that what you're working with is actually going to provide you with the data you want. In the case of what we're looking at today, this stuff is designed to monitor the health of servers, not workstations, not specific servers like Exchange boxes or anything else like that, but kind of a core general server. So you're not going to find any specific metrics on how many RPC calls on an Exchange box or anything like that. So the solution I looked at is the Microsoft Server Performance Analyzer 3.0. And as you might guess from that 3.0 version, this has been around for a little while. The original version, I think, came back and ported some of the performance tools you had in Windows 2008 back for Windows 2003. So around this time last year, they released version 3.0, which was able to talk to Server 2012. It is free, and I put that in quotation marks because nothing is free, right? You've got storage, you've got computational power, so while you are not paying anything for this, you may very well be paying somehow, whether it's resource consumption, people's time, however that might be. According to the Microsoft documentation, it can handle up to 100 servers. I think that's kind of up to you. As you'll see when we get into this tool, you can configure this in terms of the frequency of the data polls you want to do, in terms of the frequency of the storage or the processing power you want to allocate to this. You might be able to get more than that, but you know, Microsoft sells this other large product family that has configuration in the name. So I think that's definitely where they want to draw the line in terms of where they think something is a viable alternative and where you need to pay something. It's customizable, which is a big deal for me. There are some things I want to see, there are some things that I do not want to see, and there are some things that I agree with Microsoft about and some things that I don't agree with Microsoft about. So I like the ability to change a little bit and have a little bit of control over what we're doing. It has historical capability, and frankly, I think it's pretty much useless if you don't have some sort of historical capability. Trending and forecasting are essential to what I do. It's essential to providing any sort of context, I think, whenever you're doing any performance monitoring. You're back to that question of the number is 20. Is 20 good? Is 20 bad? Well, if it was 8 for the last 3 years and all of a sudden it went to 20, that's something you should pay attention to. If it was 40 and then it went down to 20, well, then you're probably not going to worry too much about it, depending on what it is. It has some guidance, which is both useful from the standpoint of us as a working sysadmin and getting some information and guidance there. But I also have found that this is a great political tool. So you always get into these arguments, back to that argument I had with the Exchange guy about the 100% CPU utilization, right? Nobody ever wants to admit that their infrastructure might be a problem because they perfectly forecasted and built their infrastructure, and whatever problems may be out there certainly have to be yours, not theirs, right? So if you can pull some information and guidance from Microsoft over what are acceptable levels, I think that can help with the political stuff. Not only does it forestall some arguments with different teams, but sometimes it allows you to just go further up that management chain and say, hey, look, don't argue with me. I'm not going to get in this fight. This is what Microsoft says you should have. So take a look at their recommendations. You do what you want, but just understand you're out of scope for what Microsoft is recommending. And that's gotten me through a couple of situations. So this is targeted at Windows 2008 and later. It's really not a much use for anything earlier, and frankly, I hope most of you don't have anything much older than that out there, although I'm sure you probably do. And one of the interesting things to me is this is an agentless solution. When you get into the monitoring world, there's all these arguments back and forth about whether agent-based solutions or agentless-based solutions are superior, and that's probably something that could take up 2 hours in a round table. I don't particularly have a conviction, but I've had bad experience with agent-based solutions, and I've had bad experience with agentless solutions. All other things being equal, if you're not touching my boxes in any sort of permanent way, I'm happier with that. If you're working with any sort of single image master or something like that, whether it be PVS or another technology, when you start working with agent-based solutions, it usually brings up another layer of complexity. Anybody who's ever worked with edge site on a PVS farm probably knows what I'm talking about. Requires some additional tweaking to make sure that you don't have duplication and those sorts of things. So all other things being equal, I like agentless if I can get away with it. I guess I have to confess about this. One of my worst experiences was with IBM Director. Anybody ever used IBM Director? A couple of you. So it's probably a good product now because I don't use it much, but back a few years ago, the IBM Director agents were god-awful. They did things like leak non-page memory, and back when we had 32-bit Citrix farms, we would find that our largest consumers of kernel memory were our stupid IBM monitoring agents. They would blue screen boxes sometimes. They would do all sorts of god-awful things because they were delved deep into the kernel and they weren't particularly well written. And I ended up actually at one point peeling off the IBM Director agents because they were the single biggest cause of instability in my 32-bit farm. So yeah, I do carry a bit of a grudge about agent-based solutions, even though I'm trying really to be fair. And that was probably a long time ago and is no longer true, but I have some bad memories. So requirements. SQL Server 2008 R2. Express is fine. It's what is recommended. But it's still a SQL Server. You're still bringing that into your infrastructure. You may have rules about that stuff. You're obviously going to have to pay attention to patching. If you're doing this kind of on your own as a skunkworks thing, you better pay attention to it. It's kind of a job-threatening thing. When you put up a SQL Server somewhere, don't patch it, and some vulnerability comes through and you've managed to screw up the security posture of your data center. Those security guys don't have much of a sense of humor about that stuff. So make sure what you're doing is either signed off on, patched, or you have some sort of strategy of dealing with it. You need a data storage location, of course. And of course, you're going to need read-write access to that location. That's not as bad as you might think. Data that is pulled from the servers is stored there temporarily, but it is then pulled into the SQL Server. So in terms of a data collection point over time, you don't really need that on that file share. It's kind of a temporary moving place. Now, of course, your database is going to grow as you pull this information into it. You need a console that requires the .NET Framework 4. It is an issue for us, but occasionally I do hear of some places that have issues with certain versions of the .NET Framework. But that's the console only. So that can be a monitoring station somewhere. That can be an admin thing, a non-production kind of server or box. So it's typically not an issue. The user account, there is not complexity here in creating different user accounts for different roles. The same account for SQL is used as the same as data collection, so you're probably going to need a domain account. And it's going to need to have access to the PLA service, the performance log and alerting service. So that's probably something that's going to have to be run by whoever manages your domain infrastructure. And if you happen to manage that all yourself and that isn't an issue, that's fantastic. And are you hiring? So here's a simple diagram of the architecture here. We have the console over on the left. The console uses advisor packages or rules. You have a SQL database, and then you have your network, your file share, and then your individual servers over here at 3. So the console fires itself up. It does a lot of querying over on the servers, event tracing for Windows events, performance counters, WMI queries, registry keys, some configuration files, pulls all that information, plops it over on the file share for a while, then pulls that information out of the file share into the SQL database and prepares the reports. And then the advisor packages interpret the data and add some reporting capability to it and give you some idea of what means what. And it also does nice, pretty things like graphs and things like that. Anybody have any questions at this point? Yeah?
Does that mean the console has to stay open for the continuous query to happen? Or?
So the question is, does the console have to stay open? So yeah, if you're going to do reoccurring data pulls, it's going to need to be open. There isn't any sort of scheduling for batch sorts of things. What you can do, which I was going to talk about a little bit later, is there are provisions for automation here, including PowerShell. So you can start the console, fire off the data collection, pull the stuff in, shut it back down, rather than leaving it open. So yeah, so there is some provision for that so that you don't have to keep it open all the time. But again, you know, we're talking about a product here, which you'll see a little bit later, is surprisingly sophisticated in some ways and surprisingly not in others. What's that?
Does it say like Insight Manager?
Well, yeah. So to just sum up that architecture, the performance analysis is started from the console, or it can be scripted. There's a couple of ways. There's actually some PowerShell commandlets that you can register and use PowerShell for. Or this is even simple enough that you can probably use a good old-fashioned scheduled task. The PLA, performance logs and alert service, collects all this information for you, and then it pulls that data into SQL Server and generates the reports in the advisor pack. So installation, it's a single cab file that includes the console, the CoreOS, Hyper-V, and IIS advisor packs. It does not include the .NET Framework or SQL Express, so I suggest you install those first, because it's really not even smart enough to prompt you. It doesn't go out and check and say, hey, Bozo, go do this. And the cab file, there's a lot of tools you can use to work with cab files, right? But make sure whatever you use preserves the folder structure inside a cab file. I gave you the extract32 command line here because the advisor packs actually have to be in a subdirectory in order to be read properly. If you use some other tool that just extracts them to a straight folder, it's not going to find the advisor packs, and you're not going to be able to get anything out of it. So you can go ahead and extract the cab file. There's a different version for 32 or 64-bit, of course, and then create your folder shares to store data. You can store data on the console machine. Just use the UNC path for reference. I'll talk a little bit about that later, but that may not probably be the best idea, particularly if you're monitoring an infrastructure of any size. And I say that with the caveat that your console machine is probably not going to be a very beefy machine. If you do happen to have a good admin machine out there that you can put the console on, that's fine. But this is the caveat I was talking about, the data storage. So the event tracing for Windows infrastructure in Windows is used by lots of things out there, and developers can even leverage it themselves. But the way it works is it uses a circular buffer that stores data and attempts to write it when the machine isn't particularly busy. So on a highly loaded server or on slow file I/O to the data storage location, the buffer just says, I can't get rid of this data, stuff's going on, I'm going to drop it. And it can be not all that uncommon, depending on what you're looking at, for that data to be dropped. So Microsoft suggests using a location that supports fast I/O to prevent this, and they even suggest at one point to use separate folders for each target server that's going to report in. I don't know that you really need to do that. I mean, it's all going to be a question of the IOPS and the I/O that's available on wherever you're storing that stuff. So that's the caveat I have with using the console machine. If you have a box that has great I/O, and the easy way around this, of course, right, is an SSD, that'll probably handle anything just fine. Yeah?
What's the size of the logging?
So the question is what's the size of the logging? That's going to depend on you. How many servers, how many things you want to look at, how frequently you want to look at. And again, this data gets processed and then sucked into the SQL server. So you're not, I think, in any practical way talking about anything very large. You know, maybe a couple hundred megabytes at the most. And you know, that's if you're doing like 100 servers and you're going after everything. But part of that analysis process is to pull that data off of that and suck it into the SQL database. So the only place you're really going to see permanent growth on data storage is that SQL database. Was there someone else over? No? Okay. So network stuff. Port 139 is used by the PLA service, so that needs to be open. The easy way to test this is if you can run Performance Monitor remotely against a machine, things are probably going to work. You probably have the access that you need across your firewall. It's another subject that I didn't want to deal with in the presentation today, but if you got differing subnets, which are certainly possible, see the documentation. That can be handled. There's just additional configuration. As I mentioned before, the same user account needs to be used, so you have to give some thought into your Windows authentication and what user account you're going to use. And if the console and the target servers are in different domains, see the documentation. That can basically be handled by setting up a user account with the same name and password, even though it's different domains. But there's a couple of things you should probably take a look at there if you're looking at multi-domain situations. And it's all detailed out in the user manual that Microsoft provides. One thing I will tell you, the user manual is a little confusing. You can tell the product has gone through rep. They always refer to a management menu in the product, and there is no longer a management menu. There's a configuration menu. And there's only about 8 menus in this thing. So you can imagine me sitting here reading this document going, there's only 8 menus. How can I be missing the management menu? So again, you know, it's a project. It's a product that has its rough edges. So getting started, what you do basically, and we're going to walk through this in a minute, is you create a new project. You provide the name of the SQL server in the instance, so make sure you note that when you set it up, because there is no browse capability. You specify a database name, and remember this, because if you want to switch projects, and a project is just a collection of data, right? You're going to have to know the name of it. And again, there isn't a browse capability, so you need to remember the names of your different databases. If I'm being cynical, I'm suggesting that such obvious features might have been overlooked not to poach more expensive products that Microsoft sells, because that's, I don't know that I would really consider that excusable not to have a browse, but that's just me. Once the project database is created, that can take a little bit of time if the resources are busy. That's usually purely a function of the hardware that you're dedicating to SQL Express. As part of the configuration, you select the advisor packs, and you can change this later. This simply means the advisor packs are the rules. So there's a Core OS, there's an IIS, and a Hyper-V. So you can, at the configuration time for the project, specify, I only want the Core OS advisor rule to be run against this, or I only want the IIS, or whatever particular rule that you're interested in. That's changeable later, so don't worry if you decide to change here. There's a field to add servers, and you can import from a file. There's a remark field here that we'll see, and don't overlook that because I did it first, but that's a searchable field. So if you have, 3 different Citrix farms or something like that, and you're divided up by geography or something, if you put the location or some sort of searchable term in there, then you can run a project just against those particular servers rather than having to do it against the whole group. Use the test configuration button. servers will be added even if they fail the test. So it's not going to do any of your job for you. It will add it what it tells you to do, so there's no reason, I don't think, really not to test your configuration. So a couple limitations. Your analysis interval must be at least as long as the advisor pack, and that's typically 60 seconds. So if you're looking for some short point in time, like you want to get 2 seconds or something like that at the beginning of every hour or something like that, that's not going to work for you. And you can't run multiple analysis runs at the same time. It's a single thing. It sends out the request, it does the data, gets the data, it processes it, it moves on to the next collection. So one of the things that was interesting about this is back in the prior version with SPA 2.0, there were a lot more advisor packs for things out there like Active Directory and other servers. And these seems to have disappeared in the 3.0 version. Again, I read these phrases like advisor packs and I keep thinking about other very expensive Microsoft management products. So I don't know that we're going to see anything more in terms of advisor packs for Microsoft, but the good news is they provide documentation to make your own. And as I'll show you a little bit later, you can alter these things and customize them pretty much on your own, even without any SQL knowledge. So you can get a fair amount of customization from it that way. It's just, I don't think Microsoft is going to go out of their way to provide a lot of different analysis packs for you. If I can suggest, sure, what's your question?
Is there any community forums, sites?
So the question is there any community forums or sites? There are some things out there. I have not seen much dialogue. I don't think there's a dedicated news group or anything like that. It usually comes under the performance news groups at Microsoft. There's some blogs where guys talk about things, but there's not really an active development community. What I would suggest if you're looking to do this is go take a look at the PAL tool, the Performance Analysis of Logs, which is out at Codeplex. Everybody know what Codeplex is? It's kind of Microsoft's open source software development site. If you go to codeplex.com, that's C-O-D-E-P-L-E-X, and you look at PAL, PAL's a long-running tool that was developed by some of the performance consultants at Microsoft. And they must have, I don't know, 20 threshold files or something. This is a tool designed to be run against a single server. But these are all XML-based threshold files, so you can crack those open and take a look at what they are, and there's documentation on how to write your own. If that's something that interests you, like you have needs for a Dynamics or an Active Directory or some other thing, I would start with those threshold files and take a look at those and work from that maybe into something that you might want to add into SPA. Again, I don't want to overstress this, but you know, they sell some products that are pretty close to this functionality, so I don't think you're going to see a whole lot from Microsoft. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. So this is just the console that comes up, and you can see at this point I'm connected to SQL Express into my Test 1 project because this was a project that I was running earlier today, and I was running it on this local machine on the laptop. So I ran this information and I got a warning that came up. If we want to run this again, I'll just mark this and I'll run the analysis here. You get a couple of options. Again, we're specifying the advisor pack. This is basically the threshold file, what we want to run against this. In this case, I'm just going to choose the core OS. It's a configurable data collection interval. I'm going to leave it at the default of 60 seconds. And of course, you can set up some batch features here for repeating the collection however often you want to do that. So you've got options here on how frequently you want to do it. But let's just go ahead and run this for 60 seconds. Sure, take my credentials. You're not going to do this, Jimmy. There you go. And so I'm going to try not to do anything here for 60 seconds to get a nice clean trace to show you what it looks like when there isn't an issue. So you can see it initializing, collecting the data here. And again, this is this process of sending the PLA service out to the target. In this case, it's circular. It's going right back to this machine here. It'll collect some data. You'll see what it does here in a minute. It'll give you a status report on where it is. So I really should have thought of something more to say that was exactly 60 seconds long, but you'll have to forgive me. Yes?
Is the 100 server limit based on the project or the database?
It doesn't have, well, the question is the 100 server limit based upon anything in terms of the project or the database itself? I can't find a physical constraint that locks you down to 100 servers. That's just the suggestion from Microsoft. Obviously, the more data you have, the more servers, everything else, that SQL Express database is going to get a little more cumbersome. I think you could probably monitor 120 servers. You could probably monitor 150. I don't think there's anything stopping you other than the unwieldiness of the data sets that you may need to deal with and the amount of resources you want to generate or allocate to it. So you can see us importing that ETW information here. And this, by the way, is where you usually fail if you have a heavily loaded system or a heavily loaded server that can't actually process that circular buffer out. And the reports process here is essentially those advisor packs, taking that information and applying some intelligence to it at this point. Okay, so we're completed. And at this point, it actually found a warning, right, from the CoreOS advisor pack. So we've got a couple of buttons here. We have view the latest report, we've got find reports, and we've got some view charts. So let's go ahead and see what was the problem we had while we were doing absolutely nothing. I've got pretty pictures, I've got green check marks, I've got yellow boxes, right? So the net of all of this is, I don't really have an issue. It flagged me for an issue, but what's the issue? The CPU power mode. The system has a low load, but my CPU is actually running fairly high. So again, you certainly can't turn your brain off when you're doing this sort of thing. You have a warning here, but you don't really have an issue. But one of the reasons I wanted to show you this is there's some intelligence here beyond just straight perfmon counters, right? It looks at configurations of the machine. It makes some sort of estimation of what you can do. Every time I run this in my environment, by the way, I get this because on our HP servers, because of some issues with prior firmware, we have disabled all the power saving features in the BIOS. So it's at the static high performance plan. I don't know if any of you guys have run into this, but there are quite a few articles out there, especially for anybody working with hypervisors. I think VMware tells you to disable it now. Citrix has had an article out for a long time telling you to turn it off in Zen Server. So I get flagged on this stuff all the time. So I never get a clean performance report. It's kind of a shame. But so we've got all these various categories that we'll look at and give you kind of the summary in terms of the check marks and the check boxes. Let's go over and take a look at the system overview. This is a lot of the configuration information that is pulled out here. And hopefully, can you guys all read that? Is that viewable? It's not blurry or anything? Okay, I see some nods. So you also get some base configuration information that's gathered here. So you also have a kind of on-the-cheap configuration management solution because it will pull this stuff every time. So if you add memory or something like that, you might be able to see a change in a report here, page file locations, all of that good stuff. Here's your power profile. This gets particularly useful in large environments like where I am because these teams tend to roll through with standardized procedures and they don't always email everyone they should, so one day all of a sudden something's different. It's nice to be able to pull those things. You've even got your installed Microsoft updates here in terms of the system overview, BIOS versions, all that kind of stuff, which is nice to be able to pull without having to actually go on the box and look around. On the CPU tab, again, we've got CPU identification, the types, processor revisions, all that kind of stuff that's useful for your documentation projects, so you don't have to do this by hand. You can just pull this right out of here. By the way, this is an exportable report if you want to do that. The CPU consumption details, you get some interesting statistics here. So this will actually start breaking down which CPU ID was running hardest, what particular things was happening. Were you looking at deferred procedure calls? Were you looking at interrupts? That sort of information. This is nice, I think, the top activities in terms of processes. I ran into a small bug doing this presentation. For some reason, reports exported in another installation of SPA don't seem to want to pull into a different installation, even though you're supposed to be able to do it. But I had some nice stuff showing you the activity of things like the Splunk daemons and things like that kicking off at various times collecting data. Not that it was a problem, but it was interesting if you wanted to be able to do something and go look for a particular problem. Note that you've also got a find box up here, which is also searchable. So if you're just trying to find something in amongst all of these various things, like, let's see, maybe we want to look at the antivirus. You can put that beginning name of that process in there, and it will highlight you and help you spot what's going on in amongst all of these different columns and all the other information. On the memory side here, again, we've got top 10 processes in terms of average user mode memory, kernel mode memory, all of this sort of stuff that's tremendously useful for monitoring and trending over time. You just run these reports, stick them out there, and when you have time, you can take a look at this, and what I'll show you in a little bit is you can do some comparisons between the different reports. And all of this stuff is just kind of one-click simple, right? You run it, you kick it out there, you have the stuff if you need it. If you have the time to look at it now, that's great, but if you need it for historical purposes, it's out there. The disk I/O stuff, again, some of the same information. You can pull your read operations, write operations, disk queue length, disk latency. By the way, I'm kind of no longer a believer in disk queue length. I've been burned, I think, a few too many times by having disk controllers misreport information on queue lengths. So I'm much more of a believer these days in the latency measurements, with the exception of when you're not virtualized. Any of these numbers that are expressed in terms of something per second, throw a hypervisor into that mix, those numbers are no longer that reliable anymore because you're essentially time slicing those VMs, right? So those numbers I don't think are as reliable as they are on physical hardware. Your disk consumption details, all this kind of stuff here. You've got more information than probably you frankly ever wanted, but it's there for you if you need it. And of course, you got a network section as well. You're covering the, the 4 major categories of performance analysis: CPU, memory, disk, network. On the actions, you can do some interesting things here. You can view historical reports and you can compare reports. So let's go ahead and compare this to the previous report. So this pops up a column with report 1 and 2. You can see I've got differences here. Because I had some actual activity in this report number 2, I'm not getting flagged on the power mode because it was actually doing something. But I am going to get flagged on memory pressure. So once I've got this comparison, then I can go over and look at memory and say, well, what precisely is going on over here? I have my 2 columns. I can compare this stuff between report 1 and report 2. Get a look at the, what are we probably looking at? Cache faults. So yeah, here, if we're looking at cache faults for a second, I had about 70 of those on my idle system. I was running about 422 of those per second on my non-idle system. Page faults, I think that there's really interesting, right? Now, again, this includes hard and soft page faults. So I've got 4,000. I still have some logical page faults happening versus the 12,000 here. But this is the really telling number. Pages input per second is actually a physical fault out to disk to read a page back into memory. So that's your true hard fault rather than a soft fault. So you can see I had some of these probably because the system was just firing itself up with SQL Server. But if you look at the actual page inputs when I'm doing something, that was significantly higher. It will only do 2 of these at a time. And you can load an exported report, which I'll show you in a minute. And you cannot do comparisons for some reason on that. That's a straight viewer. So, but you do have the options here on terms of comparing reports. When you go into comparing reports, again, you can also go into search. You don't have to do the previous one. You can take a look at your date range here, how the reports are done by what advisor pack. If you're doing a particular server name or server group, then you just hit the search button and it will give you the option. So you can go back and look at a report that you have from a month ago, 3 months ago, 6 months, last year, however you want to do that if you're wanting to do your comparisons. So one of the interesting things we kind of did with this at one point is we just sat down and told ourselves, well, we need to be alert to login storms, right? That's kind of the classic core 1 thing to monitor in a Citrix environment, right? Everybody comes in, what's happening from 8:50 to 9:15 or something like that in the morning when everyone logs in. So we ran some information and everything like that, and we looked at our stuff and we said, hey, we're great. We're doing really well that time of day. So we think we're golden here. And then it didn't take us too long before we figured out that we'd made an obvious mistake with that. Anybody know what that mistake was? Time zones. Time zones. Not all of my users are in the Eastern time zone. So, okay, well, we were all right for the Eastern time zone. That's most of our users. We should be fine for the Pacific time zone, right? No, not really. Why? Well, because all those East Coasters are logging in when there's no one on the systems. They're essentially idle. All those West Coast people are logging in when there's already people on the system, right? So they have to compete with resources. So one of the more interesting things we did with one of these tools by watching the session numbers is the thing that we overlooked about the East Coast people, which is they eat lunch. And some of them like to close their apps and log off when they eat lunch. So not only did we have the issue of the Pacific Coast people logging in when there was already a fair amount of load on the system, but log-ons and log-offs are both pretty expensive events in the terminal server Citrix world, especially when you're using roaming profiles like we are. So not only did you have that issue, but you also had a lot of people now on the East Coast logging out at the same time to go eat lunch, while the West Coast people were logging in as well. And the first couple things we figured out pretty quickly. The third one, it took us a while to think of. Apparently we just thought our customers never ate. They subsisted on oxygen or something like that, I don't know. So let's go ahead and close out of this. If you want to start a new project, it's fairly simple. File, new project. This will, of course, close your current one. You get this wizard. This is one of the things I talked about before. You need to know your SQL Server name. You need to know your database. Your database name can be specified. That's anything. It will create it for you. And it is smart enough, at least at this point, to grab the data location once it finds a valid SQL installation. So by the way, you can't do special characters in here. It just wants a character string. It doesn't like spaces. It doesn't like any special characters or anything like that. So it wants plain text for a name. This is part of that configuration of the database. This is actually, at this point, creating the database for me in SQL Express. I can choose which one of these advisor packs I want. We're going to take a look at this advisor pack a little bit later. Sadly, the Hyper-V one is not really where I wanted it to be. So again, I'm going to specify this laptop. Here's your import button, by the way, again, if you want to import a list of servers. Anybody catch me goof that up? I forgot to specify the right name of this laptop. But
Import, is that like a Active Directory import or just like a CSV or?
I'll show you here in a sec. If I can actually yes, each project is going to be its own database in SQL Express. I'm sorry? I didn't hear you. Well, we've used it for a bit of everything. We've used it for both troubleshooting a particular situation. We've also used it for building some baseline and configuration stuff over time. And frankly, over time, some of the things we did with the free tools allowed us to justify some proposals and some other things to actually spend some money. So we're increasingly using this less, but there are some situations and things that we need to do it. What we find most of the time now is there's usually a specific situation, like a large customer or a separate farm or something like that, where we want to do something a little bit different than the standardized performance monitoring that we've set up already. So we want to do something a little customizable or work with them. We'll stand up something like this that will allow us to hopefully cover that, do that. I'm tempting the live demo gods here. Nothing like what Tim does, but so if you hit this import library, this will allow you to pull in CSV. Somebody had that question, I think, about what the import button will let you do. So CSV is essentially the only thing that will come in, but if you can export that list of servers, then I think you're in pretty good shape. And let's see if I manage to do this right. And it's that simple. I mean, literally this process, you could set this up in 15 or 20 minutes back at work and be collecting data that quickly. So it can be useful in terms of an actual live troubleshooting event. You have to be a little careful where you've got stuff placed when you're doing live troubleshooting, right? You don't want to make the situation any worse than it already is. And I have run into situations where we've had things so heavily loaded that I can't get complete data. You know, the ETW circular logging thing becomes an issue. Sometimes you can't even get performance monitor counters. You'll see these gaps and things. I particularly find that whenever I'm I/O bottlenecked. Whenever the disk subsystem is bottlenecked on the box, then I typically know I'm going to have a hard time getting some data.
Also, those patches are not applied? I guess what I'm saying is, will it go online and check which patches are available?
No, it won't do any sort of patch management for you. It will report the list of things that are installed, but it won't check against a baseline or check see it's available, anything like that. Right.
Is this a light load? Is the server performance advisor a light load or a medium load or heavy load?
So the question is about the intrusiveness of the data collection. I consider this a fairly light load, particularly when you're working off the defaults. You're pulling data for about 60 seconds. You're pulling some data here, but you're not pulling an enormous amount of data. Were you to repetitively run this, on 5-minute intervals or something like that, then I might get a little bit more concerned. From this standpoint, I think you are, for the most part, fine. That always, of course, varies by your system and by your environment. The closer you are to a bottleneck or a problem, the less it takes to push you over. And at least in my experiences, what I always find is this performance stuff never happens on a linear basis, right? If you get, 50 users on a terminal server or something like that, and you have 50% CPU, you're not going to be able to get 48 more users and be at like 95% CPU and be fine. You're going to get like 30-some or something, and you're going to find yourself tipped over, or at least that's the way it usually works in my environment. It's never a linear scale. So that's one of the reasons why I suggest getting some of that trending information, getting this running before you have a problem, so you have some idea where you are, how far you have to go. But I hate to say it, I hate to admit it in front of you, but sometimes in a crisis, you know that what you're doing isn't helping, but you still got to have the data. You might make it a little worse, but you can't fix it without the data. So you may have to take that hit and take that bullet, particularly if you're only doing a 60-second snapshot. If it's bad and then you go for terrible for 60 seconds and you're back to bad, but you have some data now that can help you get out of bad, I think that's probably an acceptable price to pay. But your mileage may vary. Does that make sense? So on the configuration menu, this is that menu that's referred to as management, by the way, in the documentation. You can configure the advisor packs. So for example, you can look at the Core OS advisor pack here and hit configure, and this will give you some idea of what the intelligence is that is applied to these things. Like if you look at average CPU utilization on any node, this will open it up and give you an explanation. It tells you that the rule is enabled in this particular advisor pack. Tells you that the average CPU utilization on at least one node has exceeded the threshold. It recommends what you should do. Yeah, right? Take the load off your CPU. Thank you very much. The interesting thing down here, though, is what is the threshold number? The CPU high threshold percentage is 80%. I don't know that I'm terribly comfortable with that. Your environment may vary. I don't particularly like getting past about 70%. I don't want to start getting alerts at 80 because I know I'm probably on my way to 90. So if you're more cautious, if you have something like an SLA you're looking to set up with a customer or something like this, this setting is editable. You can change this down to 70, 60, whatever makes you happy. So you've got that customization option here, which I think is pretty important anytime you're working with this stuff. Disk I/O under pressure, I think, is another one that is interesting here.
Point in time data, or like for the 60 seconds, because like with CPU, like whenever, especially on Citrix, if somebody does anything, it will spike for a moment.
Right. I'll show you the charts on some of the stuff. So essentially what it does is take averages, but on the charting you can get some idea of what's happening on a more individual basis. So here's another one. The setting here is disk latency threshold at 25 milliseconds. Depending on your user base and what they're used to, disks that are 25 milliseconds or more to respond is probably not a real happy user base. Particularly if you've got people out there who are used to laptops with SSDs or something like that. This is one of those settings that I can consider knocking down to maybe 20, maybe 15, depending on how critical performance is to your environment. But a 25 millisecond disk is a pretty slow disk these days. So you have intelligence here. You have these reports that will give you some information, but still take a look at what the thresholds are. Some of this information I think has come from Microsoft documentation that is relatively old. I actually think this disk latency threshold comes from an Exchange doc that dates back to Exchange 2003. So obviously we've come a long way in disk storage since 2003. And again, that's not necessarily depending on the application and how it's facing users and their sort of tolerance for delay is a place that you want to be. So we'll close out of this. Let's look at some charts. So here's the charts that build. We've got CPU selected here at this point. You can go to Pick Series and choose whatever you want here. You can take the whole run. And by the way, this is one of the easy ways to get an idea of how many performance monitor counters are actually being pulled. This is a fair amount of stuff here. So this goes back to the issue of the load that you're putting on your servers. I don't think, I mean, as much as this is, in many cases, a lot of this stuff is probably going to return 0 or null to you. You're probably not using both TCP 4 and 6 at the same time. You might be, but you know, I think that's unlikely. So this will give you some idea of what's out there.
Ian?
Yeah.
Most of the counters that we were looking at there, I assume those are actually going to be the WMI polls?
I think they are. Most of these are WMI. As a matter of fact, the hover on some of these will actually tell you what it is. And a matter of fact, let me come out of charts here for a second and go back to the report. Let's look at memory, I think. Right. So when you go to the reports, if you hover over the tooltip, will tell you, is this a performance monitor counter? Is it a WMI query? If it's configuration information, if I can find the right one right here, some of the stuff, there's a WMI counter, for example, will actually tell you like if this is a registry key and what the registry key it was pulled from, that sort of thing. Let's close you out and go back to our charts. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question. Some of that information is already being gathered by Windows, so some of it you're already paying the price for, but some of it is not necessarily. I mean, some of those perfmon counters, some of those WMI queries, depending on what you've already got running, you're going to be initiating those, I think, through this process. They're not going to be there constantly in use. But some of that data, you're right, is kind of instrumented into the OS now. It just depends on what particular piece of data you're looking at. And let's see if I can, you can also zoom in on these things, except I don't have any particular data to zoom in here. You can do a day of week trend analysis, and you can also do an hour of day trend analysis. And again, these things are zoom-inable. This is a horrible part of the interface, but I don't know if you can see this tiny little button down here by the arrow. That's actually the reset button on the scale. So that's pretty horrible to be able to see, I think. So let's close out of this and open up a different project.
So on the chart,
Mm-hmm.
are you going to have just the average for that analysis run up there, so that you see multiple analysis runs, or are you going to see the actual series of data?
It depends on the amount of data you have in your project. That project there was the thing I just set up here, so we essentially had no data from that one instance. But I think, for example, here, you're going to see some more data. And again, this is, if you're used to working with perfmon, this is kind of the same thing. You can select or deselect on the fly to get these things added to the graphs. You can hover over here and get a point in time. And so you have something slightly more interested here. This is a candlestick chart where they attempt to calculate the averages but show you the min and max as well. And the hour of day one, again, because I'm not pulling regular data, that's not going to show you a whole lot. But again, we can come in here in the pick series and let's say we're no longer interested in the CPU. What else have we got here? Let's look at disk I/O. It's a laptop, that should be terrible, right? So again, you're color-coded. You can come down here and choose whichever particular ones you want. Like, I'm not a huge one anymore about disk queue length, so if those were selected in this particular set, I might not be interested in that. I might be mostly interested in things like the write operations per second, that sort of thing, or the responsiveness on the disk. So when you have larger data sets, these charts get a lot more interesting. And I had some more interesting things to show you until I ran into this issue about importing reports. Which, by the way, is easy enough. You can open a report file, and the only thing that you're missing here essentially is that actions button that you had before that allows you to compare, but you're still looking at pretty much the same report information. And you still have that nice find feature. It's simple enough to export the report. I can't remember if I showed you this before. But off the options menu, this is what accounts for data file management. You can export or delete. And of course, you can always choose something like the previous. I think we did that on the two-part comparison. Anybody have any questions at this point? Yes?
I noticed that we talked about importing multiple servers earlier. What does this really look like when you're talking about running these queries against multiple server sets? And I mean, are the charts consolidated so you can see comparisons from the different machines, or are they all individual, basically individual machine?
What you get is essentially the column setup. So you get a lot of scrolling is what you get. I don't really know how else to put it other than that. I think when you're dealing with those large data sets, you're probably going to be working in the charts quite a bit more. I would probably, I mean, you can gather that data and then choose to use that find function so that you can narrow down the particular number of servers you're looking, if you're breaking it down by geography, site, something along those lines, to get a little bit more manageable. Again, I think this was the earlier question about what's the limit on how many servers you can actually use with this tool. I think it becomes more of a function of what you can deal with the reporting and how cumbersome that is, how much time it takes, how readable it is, all the rest of that. So the other thing that I wanted to talk to you about configuring these advisor packs is I would strongly suggest that you go through and take a look what all of these are. It's very nice to have a product that does something, but for example, if we look at the Hyper-V advisor pack, there's not a whole lot here that isn't in the Core OS advisor pack, is there? We've got some nice things like, is it detecting SLAT? Some of these other options that are in here. I think there's a Hyper-V host memory counter or something like that in here. But this is not what I would consider a highly intelligent Hyper-V analysis tool. Again, I think we're back to that idea that they're not going to give you something for free, that they're charging you a lot for in another product. But the fact that you can easily edit some of these things and change the threshold values, I think is pretty useful. I would encourage you to do that. Figure out some ideas of what's acceptable in your environment. And this comes back again to a bit of the data analysis portion, right? What's useful in this if you're going to set up some sort of SLA or a metric number with a customer. You have to agree on what you find acceptable and what you don't find acceptable. It's another true story. I can't make this stuff up. We had a fairly large customer who had their own farm a few years ago, and they were adamant about performance issues. And they had a lot of bandwidth and connectivity problems, which they didn't believe they had. They thought for sure it was our server. So we set up a lot of these conference bridges where we were talking with them and discussing various issues. And I kid you not, what they would do is they would get like 6 people in, and in our tax application, there was just a bitmap over on the side. It was just like a piece of colored screen, right? So they discovered somehow or another that if they put the mouse pointer over there and they moved it in a tight circle really, really fast, if they got like 4 people to do that, it would start driving CPU on each core that person was on. So they would call us and say, look what happens. We have 4 people in here moving the mouse pointer really fast in this corner, and all of a sudden it's slow. You imagine taking that to your development team going, well, we have these users that apparently want to have 4 people using the mouse pointer in a tight circle over a non-active part of the screen, and we don't want you to profile on CPU this way. So yeah, what can you do with something like that? All I will say about that is that customer ended up leaving us, and they are now out of business. But those are some of the things that that you might want to do with something like this, where you can set up something with a large customer or an isolated customer in a farm. Anybody have any questions at this point?
So,
go ahead.
You were talking about modifying the management or the advisor packs.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned earlier that you never get a clean run because you always get the warning
on the power state on these particular boxes, right?
Can you actually disable that particular check in the advisor pack? I mean, I assume you can do that, right?
That is a configuration thing, and I don't, off the top of my head, yeah, CPU power mode right there. You can disable it. So you can take that check out.
So my assumption is you can disable, you can change thresholds, probably can't add new things in.
There is a development document that will allow you to build your own advisor pack. So this all, I think, comes back into SQL or T-SQL. So you could modify this if you were sufficiently knowledgeable or build your own. From what I've seen, I am no SQL expert. I will tell you that, frankly, and I am not even a particularly good coding or scripting guy. I wouldn't even use the word coding with me, but it's not bad. The SQL is understandable, so yeah, you could monitor or you could adjust those, I think, however you want to do it. All right, that's pretty much all I've got today. If anybody's got any questions, I'd be glad to talk to you some more. Thank you. And please take the time to do those evaluations. Yeah. Sure. So there are a lot of things out there. There are a lot of commercial products that have free versions that will do alerting. That's the one thing, by the way, that's completely missing from SPA. There's no provision to email you, text alert you, do anything like that. It's not a real-time monitoring thing that's going to alert you if you have problems in your environment. I don't know of anything that's free that's out there that's not essentially a starter taste from a commercial product. That said, there are roughly 1 billion companies out there, I think, that have written performance monitoring software. I think Kevin Goodman, who used to actually be in that business a few years ago, used to call it yet another monitoring software. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's something. I mean, I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I want to say that a product like even Op Manager does 10 servers or some number like that that will do text alerts and email and that sort of thing. But you know, I don't recall what the particular limitation was on that. I'm sure there's some things out there, but usually they're the starter taste to get you to buy the fuller product.